He'll be sharing sayings and adages he feels are worth keeping. His talk this morning is titled, Words from a Thresher's Life.
Thank you, Valerie. Good morning, my name is Nick Reachmack, and I'm here in spite of my attempt to get Reverend Billy Joe Jim Bob to come here and take my place. When I first talked to him, he suggested, actually insisted, that he would straighten out liberals and others who are guaranteed to have a ticket straight to hell for not thinking right thoughts. Late last night he called me, but didn't explain why he can't be here, but sincerely regretted that he couldn't be here to save us with his program of screaming hellfire and yakdom. He said he was only allowed to make one phone call. Anyway, I regret that he was unable to take my place, and I apologize since my preaching style is disappointingly different from his. Western Valley UU's theme this month is harvest. And it's a coincidence that my family name, I have been told, is the Ukrainian word for thresher. That is, a person who threshes wheat after it is harvested. Now, I have never lived on a farm, unless you count a week I spent as a child on a tobacco plantation in southern Maryland. But all my life I have been engaged in harvesting, not crops or produce, but facts and aphorisms, useful and useless, humorous and dour, secular and spiritual. And just as gathering a few weeds along with the crop can't be avoided using today's modern harvesting methods, I too may present a few of them this morning. Keep in mind what Dr. Paul Nolan, my philosophy professor at the Catholic University of America, once said, a heresy is a truth that has gone mad from loneliness. So I would like to share a number of mostly spiritually related items that I have gleaned in the course of my spiritual journey. They are not in any particular order. Most are related to Christianity, which I believe we can never know too much about. The first of these is an introductory quotation from a book by Richard Holloway, Bishop of Edinburgh, retired, from the Church of Scotland. And he wrote, "Spirituality, like morality, has been the traditional preserve of religion. Indeed, it has a whole subsection of theology itself, covering subjects such as prayer, silence, and self-discipline. But for many people today, religion is no longer a way of life that is possible for them. They may or may not believe in God, but they are no longer comfortable in any of the traditional religions. This enormous group of people has been described as the Church Alumni Association, or the Church in Exile. However, there is something faintly patronizing in these descriptions. For many people in our secular society, religion has never held any attraction for them. They have not left the church for the simple reason that they were never in it." Bishop Holloway goes on to say many nice things about these people, about how they are spiritual without needing religion, about their appreciation for the arts, the environment, their desire for a better world, a more meaningful life. I think most of us here either know someone like that or are in such groups ourselves. Upon reading this passage from the preface of Holloway's book, which was called, by the way, Looking in the Distance, subtitled The Human Search for Meaning, I immediately recognized the phrase Church Alumni Association. I had heard that phrase when I heard Jack Spong use it in his lectures and in a few of his books. Spong is the retired Episcopalian Bishop of Newark, New Jersey, and I spent 3 days conversing with him when he came to Christ Church Cathedral in Indianapolis, Indiana, to give a series of lectures which were unfortunately never publicized in time for an audience to gather. Now I have never stopped being a Christian except in traffic, when I cut a piece of wood too short, or while cooking, when I burn myself or put too much milk in my pancake batter. But these two men, whom I have just mentioned, have written many books that I have enjoyed and benefited from profoundly. I just want to mention 3 other books that Holloway has written. You may want to look them up. The first is Godless Morality, Keeping Religion Out of Ethics, which he wrote in 1999. The second is Dancing on the Edge, for Faith in the Post-Christian Age. That was written in 1997. And the third, On Forgiveness, How We Can Forgive the Unforgivable, which he wrote in 2002. Godless Morality is a very refreshing book to read, and I think we're all aware of the fact that one doesn't need religion to be a moral person. It's just try telling that to a clergyman who's not as enlightened as Bishop Holloway. Even the Archbishop of Canterbury, at the time the book was written, gave Bishop Holloway a ration of crap for writing it. But Holloway's right on. As for the post-Christian age, all the clergy are wringing their hands about it when they should have the courage to learn from contemporary theologians. Theologians are a scholarly group of people whom no one listens to, especially popes and bishops, except for a few weirdos like me. And Holloway has a little better handle on the idea of forgiveness than Elie Wiesel, whose book Sunshine was okay until I got to the end. I bought 3 of Holloway's books in Scotland, but they're all available here in the U.S. Now I wanted to say something about the Catholic Church, just some facts, no criticisms. Well, maybe no criticism, but I am appalled at the fact that there are thousands of married priests in the Catholic Church. No one knows about it, and here's why. Roman Catholics aren't the only Catholics. If my memory serves me properly, there are 26 rites in the Catholic Church. The Roman Rite is the largest, with about 85% of all Catholics claiming membership in it. But there are other rites too, for example, Dominicans, who ran the Spanish Inquisition. But Dominicans are unique in that you might think that Franciscans, Jesuits, and other religious orders are also rites, but they are not. They are simply Roman Catholic religious orders, part of that 85%. Most of the remaining 15% is called Eastern Rite, also known as the Uniate Church. These 2 names are all embracing names for the non-Roman Catholic rites. There are Maronites, another name for Lebanese Catholics, Greek Catholics, Ukrainian Catholics, and so forth. And in these churches, the Mass is very similar to the Masses held in the Eastern Orthodox churches. The Roman Catholic Church has a little secret it does not like to talk about. The priests in the other Catholic churches can be married, but only if they get married before they become priests. And once they get married, they can never become bishops in their churches, even if their wife has died. So much for celibacy. As Pope Francis said the other day, celibacy is not a dogma, it's a church custom. I want to share an experience my ex-wife and I had one evening in Seattle. We had been invited, why does the phrase sucked in come to mind, to an evening home meeting to learn about Catholic charismatics. 2 other couples, good friends of ours, also were invited, and we all went together. Well, it turned out to be learning by doing, no lectures or handouts, just an hour or more of simple songs of praise, which any preschooler could recite upon first hearing them, and then finally a question and answer period. Tom, a scary-looking high school counselor who looked like the Wolfman with jet black hair and a full beard, asked our hostess about speaking in tongues. She explained that it was not done for show or entertainment, etc., etc. But Tom persisted. He said, I'm aware of that, and I fully respect it. I'd just like to know what it sounds like. Again, she explained it was not done for show or entertainment. But Tom persisted and said, I'd just like to know how it sounds, just like that, and snapped his thumb to punctuate his question. Suddenly our hostess's head went back, her eyes snapping shut as a thumb click reverberated, and she went into a noise-making state which sounded like speech, but totally unintelligible. In that moment I glanced at John and Kathy and Tom and his wife, and all three had eyes wide open, mouth agape with jaws dropped as if to take big bites of a submarine sandwich. That joke was worth the time spent learning about Catholic charismatics. I became thoroughly convinced that God has a sense of humor, having in that moment played a joke on Tom. When the Boeing company where I worked came upon slow times, they laid off 120,000 employees. I was one of the last to leave. When we moved to Phoenix, my wife made a bad mistake. She trusted me to select our new home without her presence. Her disappointment was heartbreaking. I made the most of the other mistakes, and they were many. In 1980, after 18 years, she fired me. Divorced Catholics did not fare too well in the 70s and 80s, and even now the new Pope is getting comments about it as an issue in need of reconsideration. My parish probably would not even allow me to be an usher, so I remained Catholic by joining an Eastern Rite Catholic church near my new dwelling. Most of their congregation were Arab Americans, that is, people of Lebanese, Syrian, Jordanian, and Iraqi extraction. They reminded me of a Lebanese American I met in my freshman year, an ROTC instructor by the name of Lieutenant Bill Blatty, later to become famous as William Peter Blatty, author of The Exorcist. After the book was made into a movie, he wrote about himself in the Saturday Evening Post and told about getting ready to leave Lebanon, where he had been stationed in the U.S. Air Force. He had grown up speaking Arabic and English. As he was getting ready to return to the United States, he went shopping for souvenirs one afternoon in Beirut. He walked into a shop selling leather hassocks and camel saddles. As he entered, the proprietor said to his 12-year-old son, "Watch, my son. The American will buy a hassock with a green cedar on it." "But father," the son responded, "the one with the red camel. It's much prettier." Blatty, hearing this exchange, said, "Let me see the hassock with a red camel on it." "You see," the boy said to his father, I was right. "Yes, my son, but always remember, one hair does not make a beard." I love that aphorism. It seems to me to be much wiser than the phrase "perception is reality," which could be rephrased more truthfully as perception is the first step of knowing reality. Its corollary is related to what a Sikh with whom I worked at Boeing once said to me: "There may be some truth in what you say." When Valerie and I married about 8 years after my divorce, our spiritual interests gave us much in common. 2 years after our marriage, we honeymooned in the British Isles. In the city of York, we attended evensong at that city's cathedral and enjoyed the beauty of that service so much that upon returning home, we decided to become Episcopalians. We found their services to be quite similar to the Roman Catholic Mass, with which we had both been familiar. Soon after, my work took us to San Francisco and then on to Indiana. Valerie wound up working for the Episcopalian Cathedral in Indianapolis, which was a wonderful experience for both of us. I got to chat with our bishop, Catherine Winick, on various occasions, and she recommended books by the Protestant theologian Walter Wink. I also got to meet and spend 3 days with the now retired Bishop of Newark, John Shelby Spong, whom I mentioned previously, and his wife, Christine. Spong's books influenced me profoundly. He said that the purpose of his writing was to bring Christianity into the 21st century. You can imagine what my friend, the Reverend Billy Joe Jim Bob, has to say about that. As for bringing Christianity into the 21st century, some would reply, Christianity isn't dead. It just hasn't been tried yet. Once again, there may be some truth in what you say. Spong was a member of the Jesus Group, a group of theologians that included Wink, Marcus Borg, Corinne Armstrong, and other respected biblical scholars. It has since broken up, but many of its members have provided me with interesting hours of reading, bringing my Christianity into modern times. Some years ago, the U.S. Army used the slogan, "Be all that you can be." They could have gotten that idea from Jesus, although I doubt that West Point has a college of theology. Being all that you could be was the principal teaching of Jesus. It was the original concept of salvation. Remember, Romans and the Greeks before did not come to Jerusalem to make the Jews happy. They didn't come to make them miserable either, but both managed to do this. And Jesus was offering them a new way of living that would allow them to overcome their misery by helping each other, by healing, and by seeking justice through compassion. Jesus may have spoken about heaven, but what he taught was meant to make life better while one was still alive. When he said his kingdom was not of this world, a 21st century translation might replace the word world with this type of life. My kingdom is not of this type of life. Early Christians, actually Jews who followed a rabbi named Jesus, called the teachings of Jesus the way. And some Christians today have chosen to use this appellation for their congregations. The concept of salvation from eternal punishment began to be discussed in the 4th century, but did not become Christian dogma until the early 11th century, 1097 exactly. St. Anselm, Catholic Church, was responsible for making it part of Catholic dogma. I want to share with you something I harvested from Walter Wink, from one of his books where he wrote of powers and dominions. They are the spiritual inhibitors of that which allows us to live freely so that we can strive to develop our full potential. He defined powers as systems of domination built into human institutions. Do we have this today? Yes, and in spades. One of my favorite authors, Marcus Borg, speaks of justice not as a system of retribution, but as being true justice only when in conjunction with love and compassion. Justice must be compatible with humanity's virtues. Powers and dominations cannot comprehend this. To these, justice only means punishment. It is behavior they seek to change, not hearts, just like when you're training animals. Wink and his fellow scholars have availed themselves of current developments in philology, which is the study of languages, particularly Greek and Aramaic, and other things, Hebrew. They also study Roman history and Roman law, and of biblical archaeology. They pay a lot of attention. When he spoke, that is when Wink spoke of turning the other cheek, and the meaning of the word meek, he gave us some new insights into these phrases which have become very familiar to us. When Jesus taught his hearers to turn the other cheek, he was not advising them to cave in to Roman tyranny. Instead, he was teaching passive resistance, which Mohandas Gandhi employed after studying Christianity. Recall that Gandhi once said, "I would be a Christian, but you Christians are so unlike your Christ." Another gem I harvested years ago. Now, what was behind the turning the other cheek? Well, if you were a Jew back in Jesus' times and you had offended a Roman soldier, just as, say, a person might talk back to a cop today, that soldier might slap you, just as, say, that soldier might slap you for what you could consider yourself lucky to only be slapped. But there was a Roman law that said if a Roman strikes a non-Roman with his fist, this could cause the person struck to be allowed Roman citizenship and cause the person who did the striking to be subject to Roman punishment. This law was meant to keep people under Roman domination from becoming rebellious. Slapping is done with an open hand, but under Roman law, striking with the back of the hand is the same as striking with one's fist. Therefore, if the other cheek is turned, the soldier might be tempted to come back in the opposite direction and strike his victim a second time with the back of his hand. The reward to the victim is worth the risk, And as for the word meek, well, in ancient Greek, it did not mean a wimp. It was an adjective describing a person who could punch your lights out, but who controlled himself and refrained from doing so, especially under justifiable conditions. These are things that my friend the Reverend Billy Joe Jim Bob never learned in seminary. Wink also wrote of going the extra mile, where a Roman soldier could command a non-Roman bystander to carry his pack for him, but only for 1,000 paces. If the soldier let that person carry beyond that limit, he was subject to a punishment, usually loss of a day's salt, passive resistance. A few days ago, a noted Italian atheist, Eugenio Scalfari, got into a dialogue with Pope Francis and made the comment that Jesus used tweets such as "Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and unto God what is God's," a message with less than 140 characters. I want to share Marcus Borg's story behind that story. First of all, we know that Jews do not tolerate idols, nor do they permit graven images, both being proscribed in the Ten Commandments. How far do they take this? Well, if you believe that temple money changers were there to facilitate purchases for sacrifices, this was not their primary reason for being there, as we'll see in a moment. When Jesus said, "Bring me a denarius," he was setting a trap for the man who was trying to trap him. Remember elsewhere, he said, "Be gentle as a dove, but wily as a serpent." When the coin was produced, his next words were, "Whose head is on that coin?" The answer was, "Caesar's." Whoops. What are you doing in here in the temple with a graven image in your hand? Upon entering the temple, you're supposed to exchange your Roman coins for Jewish coins, which have no graven images on them before you come in here. The implication was, you know better, why are you breaking our laws? Jesus also accused priests, scribes, and Pharisees of making the temple a den of thieves. We usually think of this as lumping these people together with the money changers. But the money changers aren't really included. Jesus used the word den, which literally means a hideout, not a place where stealing is likely. What these men were doing was taxing peasants off their land, which the peasants had owned for many generations, forcing them to lose their main source of food and their livelihoods. These peasant victims of temple skullduggery had then to move into the villages and become artisans, a word which does not have the same meaning that advertising agencies give it today. Artisans were the bottom of the village social ladder, and that's where Jesus came from. We think of him as being a carpenter, but furniture and other construction wasn't that much in demand. Even the Romans ate while reclining, so archaeologists today aren't going to find too many sets of dining tables and chairs in the Holy Land. Another teacher whose writings I have gained much is Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, known in the secular world for having marched with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on many occasions, particularly in Selma, Alabama. Heschel wrote many profound books on Jews, their patriarchs, and Judaism. Of the books of his which I have read, I found The Sabbath to be the most spiritually rewarding, and here's a quotation from it. The higher goal of spiritual living is not to amass a wealth of information, but to face sacred moments. In a religious experience, for example, it is not a thing that imposes itself on man, but a spiritual presence. What is retained in the soul is a moment of insight rather than the place where the act came to pass. A moment of insight is a fortune transporting us beyond the confines of measured time. Spiritual life begins to decay when we fail to sense the grandeur of what is eternal in time. Time and space are interrelated. To overlook either of them is to be partially blind. What we plead against is man's unconditional surrender to space, his enslavement to things. We must not forget that it is not a thing that lends significance to the moment. It is the moment that lends significance to the thing. In Indianapolis, I spent one morning in the synagogue listening to Rabbi Michael J. Cook talk about a new book he had written called Modern Jews Look at the New Testament. In it are good discussions of how Jews look at what the Gospels and writings of Paul and others have given the world. I was impressed with the statement Rabbi Cook made about the basic value of the New Testament being a major source of Jewish history at the beginning of our common era, or as we used to say, AD or Anno Domini. In other words, the New Testament is a text used in Jewish seminaries. Who would ever have guessed? I want to briefly mention Quakers because Valerie and I, plus some of our many exchange students, became attenders at the Irvington Friends meeting in Indianapolis due to our inclination towards universalism. We became friends with their pastor, Jim Mulholland, and well acquainted with his friend and the former pastor, Phil Gully. One of our exchange students, Omar al-Fatihi, who was from Yemen, even preached a sermon there about his Muslim religion. The meetings were what we called programmed meetings, which have singing and sermons, as opposed to the traditional program of silence, unless moved by the Spirit or the inner light to speak. One gem that I harvested from the Quakers is the admonition, don't speak unless you can improve the silence. It's easy to tell when I'm not in my Quaker mode. One other gem came from a series of sermons given by Jim on the subject of using nonviolent language. Calling a name is the first step to murder. It was what was meant by Jesus when he said not to judge others. By the way, Phil Gully and Jim Mulholland have co-authored 3 books which I have read and recommend. One is If God is Love, the second is If Grace is True, and the third is If the Church is Christian. And each has written other books, Gully in particular, stories of the town of Harmony, a contemporary fictitious Quaker community in the Midwest. Well, now that you've been brought into a bit of the 21st century Christianity, what's going to be your answer when somebody asks you, do you know Jesus? Allow me to propose an answer something like this. You can be sure. And Moses, and Mohammed, peace be upon him, and Buddha, and Krishna, just to mention a few others.
Thank you, Nick. Please stand as you are willing and able and join in the singing of our closing hymn this morning, number 16, "'Tis a Gift to Be Simple." Please join me in the reading of our West Valley UU Church's mission statement. This church provides a safe place to celebrate diversity, draw inspiration for living better lives, foster social and environmental justice, and compassionately support